Myth and Fable Dictionary. So I'm just going to dip in at a random page and read different entries. So that's interesting. I've just opened this page and His other honours include the KG 1947, KT 1952, OM 1968, GBE, the Grand Master and First, or Principal Knight Grand Cross 1953, FRS 1951, and very many foreign orders and decorations. He was given his own naval command of HMS Magpie in 1950, but retired from the Navy a year later to assist his wife in her duties. Adjusting to life as the Queen's consort was not easy for a man used to giving orders and making his own decisions. Particularly galling to him was the announcement made in 1952 that the royal family would use the surname Windsor rather than Mountbatten. The Duke is said to have responded angrily with a protest. An amoeba. I'm just a bloody amoeba. The press began to repeat rumours of difficulties arising between the royal couple as a result of this dilemma, and concern was expressed when the pair spent 4 months apart in late 1956 and early 1957. Speculation that the royal marriage was in trouble was intensified when the wife of one of the Duke's aides announced she was seeking a divorce, and it was rumoured that Philip was involved. The Queen's officials sprang quickly to the couple's defence, however, denying there was any truth in these tales, and the announcement that Philip was to be granted the dignity of Prince did much to quash further speculation. The Duke of Edinburgh is an Admiral of the Fleet, a Field Marshal in the Army, Marshal of the RAF, Captain General of the Royal Marines, and Colonel-in-Chief of many regiments throughout the Commonwealth. He has been the recipient of many honorary degrees and is chairman, president or patron of many charitable foundations and organisations. Of particular note has been his interest in the Duke of Edinburgh's awards scheme, which he founded in 1956 to encourage young people to take up a range of outdoor activities, and the World Wildlife Fund, now the World Wildlife Fund for Nature. He is interested in photography, painting and four-in-hand driving, and as a young man was a keen polo player. The Duke has also never been afraid to speak his mind on matters of national importance. In 1961, for example, he caused some consternation when he told leaders of British industry that it was about time that we pulled our fingers out. Critics warned the Prince not to interfere in politics and protested at the bluntness of his language. Okay, let's leave that one there died for his courage, taking Wessex and Canute, Mercia. Edmund, however, did not live long to enjoy his share, for he died at Oxford on St. Andrew's Day, 30th November, 1016, and was buried with his grandfather, King Edgar, at Glastonbury. A later legend claims he was murdered by the son of one of his arch-rivals, Edred Striona Grasper, the assassin hiding himself in the king's privy and then stabbing the monarch twice from beneath when he came to relieve himself, leaving the dagger fixed in the king's bowels. When Edred brought the news of the murder to Canute, the outraged king promised to elevate him higher than all other nobles and had him beheaded and his head displayed on a high pole. Edmund had married in the summer of 1015 Ealdgyth, widow of Siegfried, son of Erngrim, an Anglo-Scandinavian thane, and left two infant sons, Edmund and Edward, possibly twins, who were sent to far-off Hungary for safekeeping. Okay, let's turn over the page. Now there are lots of E's, lots of kings and queens, names beginning with E. So let's do Edward I, King of England, 1239 to 1307. The eldest son of Henry III and Eleanor of Provence, who was born at the Palace of Westminster on the 17th of June, 1239, and was named after the revered Edward the Confessor. Edward inherited none of his father's weaknesses and took far more after his very able uncle, Richard of Cornwall. He also possessed his mother's strength of character, without her pleasure-loving frivolity. He was further reputed to enjoy the special favour of heaven and to have the protection of the angels. Substance for this belief was provided early on by an incident that occurred when the young Edward suddenly rose from his seat for no apparent reason during a game of chess and walked away from the table. Seconds later, a huge block of dislodged masonry crashed down where he had been sitting. Later, during his military campaigns, it was said that no weapon could touch him, though they frequently wounded those standing close to him, and he also seemed to be immune from illness. Similarly, he escaped unharmed when his entourage was struck by a lightning bolt in Gascony in 1287, leaving two retainers dead. He could, however, be hot-tempered, and records survive of bills incurred for the repair of a royal coronet, flung into the fire by the exasperated Edward, and of a fine he had to pay a servant whom he had struck and injured. The young Lord Edward, as he was known, loyally supported his father throughout the Civil War of 1264-8, and Simon de Montfort's rebellion. At the age of 15 he journeyed to Spain, where he received the honour of a knighthood from King Alfonso X of Castile, and the hand of Alfonso's half-sister, the Infanta Leonor, or Eleanor of Castile, to whom he was married at Las Huelgas in October 1254. She became the love of his life, and like his father before him, he was a faithful husband. By 1270, peace had been restored to the country, and Edward went off on the Crusades, accompanied by Eleanor. When successes led to comparisons between Edward and King Arthur, a link that the king did much to foster, holding his own round tables with feasting and tournaments. Trophies presented to him at the conclusion of his Welsh campaign included a crown reputed to be Arthur's. He was also present when the alleged graves of Arthur and Guinevere were opened at Glastonbury in 1278. When campaigning in Scotland, Edward captured and took back to England the stone of Scone, on which Scottish kings had always been crowned. Edward's reign was one of architectural flowering, and many cathedrals and abbey churches were begun. so Edward lacked parental guidance for most of his childhood. He was a lonely boy, and his longing for companions of his own age and sex were probably engendered at this early stage of his life. He also developed a passion for a range of unsuitable rustic pursuits, which were rumoured to include bricklaying, thatching and rowing. His favourites were badly chosen. The first was Piers Gaveston, a Gascon of good family who became the prince's inseparable companion and rendered himself odious to the court by the sarcastic and offensive nicknames he applied to its members. Indeed, things got so bad that Edward I banished him shortly before his death. Edward II recalled immediately after his succession and bestowed the royal earldom of Cornwall upon him. Before his father's death, Edward had been betrothed to Isabella of France, and in January 1308 he sailed to Boulogne to complete the marriage, leaving Gaveston as guardian of the realm, or regent in his absence. The wedding was celebrated with great splendour on the 25th of January, and the young couple returned to England early in February. Gaveston came to receive them at Dover, and the slobbering display of affection with which Edward greeted him caused great dismay to the new queen and her two uncles who had accompanied them. Further offence was caused at the coronation on the 25th of February, when the high honour of carrying St. Edward's crown was assigned to Gaveston, who, it is said, in purple velvet and pearls, was dressed more magnificently than the sovereign himself. The king's cousins, who had been allotted lesser honours, were so outraged that they could scarcely be prevented from coming to blows with Gaveston in the abbey itself, and they and the rest of the nobility were further incensed when it became apparent later that Gaveston had bungled the arrangement for the coronation banquet, which was badly cooked and not served till after dark. The feeling against the favourite was such that Edward, who had recently married him off to his niece Margaret, the daughter of Joan of Acre, found it politic to send him to Ireland. He soon found he could not live without him, however, and recalled him. The following year, Gaveston regained his old ascendancy over Edward and continued his offensive ways for the next 3 years, until Guy, Earl of Warwick, whom he had nicknamed the Black Dog of Ardennes, kidnapped him in June 1312 and threw him into jail in Warwick. Gaveston, realising the gravity of his plight, threw himself on the mercy of the Earl of Warwick and his accomplice, the Earl of Lancaster, but to no avail. Despite pledges of safe conduct, he was led out of the castle and up to Blacklow Hill, where he was first run through with a sword and then beheaded. Edward hid his feelings by the seemingly callous comment, "By God, what a fool he was! I would have told him never to get into Warwick's hands." He did, however, contrive to get hold of Gaveston's body and had it embalmed with aromatic herbs and buried with considerable ceremony at Windsor, the Archbishop of Canterbury presiding. Very few nobles attended. In 1314, Edward took up arms in an attempt to complete his father's Scottish campaign and suffered a complete and ignominious defeat at Bannockburn at the hands of Robert Bruce, who thus finally secured Scottish independence. A new favourite now arose in the person of Hugh le Despencer, who was appointed the king's chamberlain in 1313. He and his father, Hugh the Elder, Earl of Winchester, had both been supporters of Gaveston and gained the royal favour thereby. was especially barbarous, as recorded in a contemporary history. When the feast was over, Sir Hugh was brought before the Queen and all the barons and knights in full assembly. A list of all his misdeeds was read out to him, to which he made no reply. Then he was tied on a tall ladder in full view of all the people, both high and low, and a large fire was lit. Then his private parts were cut off, because he held out to be a heretic and guilty of unnatural practices. Even with the king, whose affections he had alienated from the Queen, when the other parts of his body had been disposed of, Sir Hugh's head was cut off and sent to London. His body was then divided into quarters, which were sent to the four next largest cities in England. Edward's end at the hands of his jailers was equally horrific. He was confined first in a cell over a pit in which lay decaying corpses, in the hope that the stench of these would be enough to kill him. But when it became clear that this would not suffice, more direct action was planned. Holinshed describes it thus: with heavy feather beds or a table, as some right, being cast upon him, they kept him down, put into his fundament a horn, and through the same they thrust up into his body a hot spit, or as others have, through the pipe of a trumpet, a plumber's instrument of iron made very hot, which passing up into his entrails, and being rolled to and fro, burned the same, but so as no appearance of any wound or hurt outwardly might be perceived. Gosh, they were absolutely brutal, weren't they? The ghastly screams of the dying king were long reputed to be heard ringing through Berkeley Castle. Actually, it says the ghostly screams, but I guess, either works. It is related that Edward once dined with the Abbot of Gloucester, who possessed a collection of royal portraits passed under French administration in 1328, and it was the powerful Flemish weavers who persuaded Edward to advance his claim to France after concluding a commercial treaty with him in 1338. Philippe's answer to Edward's pretensions was to declare his French fiefs forfeited and to invade Guyenne. Edward, no less a warrior, gracious mistress.